Perfect. Thanks, James. So I don't have any visibility as to kind of how many people are on the line or on the call or whatever, but thank you to everybody for taking the time. I really appreciate it. I know it's kind of evening time and eating into kind of volunteer time, so I really appreciate people doing that. And just in terms of the dynamics of the webinar, there's at the bottom of the screen there should be a chat facility where you can input any questions that you might have. So feel free to use that chat facility to input any questions at any stage during the piece. I'm going to just kind of talk through some of the kind of an intro piece and some of the key elements of the governance review, and then deal with some questions that I know are already out there that people have, and then I'll throw it open for any questions that will come through in the chat facility. So hopefully people will be able to kind of facilitate or use that. First of all, just to introduce myself, my name is Brian McNeese. I work with a company called Teneo. I do and have done a lot of work in sport as a consultant and as an advisor to a lot of different sports. There's very few sports in the Irish context that I haven't worked with at some point or haven't advised at a kind of strategy and governance level. So I have a lot of experience of working with various different sports. And I also come from a sports background myself. I'm involved in two sports specifically at a fairly deep level. And both kind of, I've done everything from played the sports, obviously. I've been an underage coach in both my sports. I operated as a match official in rugby, which is one of my sports. I've been an administrator. I've run executive committees in clubs. I've been a president of a club. I've been involved at club level, at regional level, at national level in the administration side of sports as a volunteer. So I understand the dynamics of sport, and in particular the sacrifices that volunteers make in relation to sport, and the positive impact that sport can have on people's lives, which is a really important backdrop to this whole governance review. And in particular, when it comes to boxing, I think boxing is, I've always described boxing as probably the most impactful of Irish sports on a couple of different fronts. On a daily basis, boxing clubs, the length and breadth of the country and the island are making a massive difference in the lives of people, and it's important to remember why the sport is so important. It's not just the success that we have in the Olympic side of things. Boxing has delivered over half of Ireland's Olympic medals in the history of our participation in the Olympic Games. So it's a successful sport in that front. And we've got both male and female representation. And increasingly on the female side, we've got more and more role models on the female side that are kind of showing the way in terms of the impact that it can have. But also from a societal perspective, there's a very significant impact that that boxing has, and that it delivers. Obviously the kind of Olympic stuff is the high profile stuff, but there are kind of few sports in Ireland that have a greater positive social impact than boxing. There's no other sport that helps kind of combat kind of the ills of disadvantage or kind of bringing communities together in the way that boxing does it. And in terms of, if you want to look at it in a crude way, in terms of a return on investment, I personally believe that boxing can give the greatest return on investment of any sport in Ireland, because of the kind of social capital that's generated through boxing and the impact that it has in the areas that it operates within. Fosters diversity, equality, inclusion at grassroots level. The makeup of the clubs and the communities that they're operating in is unparalleled in comparison to other sports. And for all those reasons, I think that boxing is our most important sport. And that said, when we kind of sat down and had a look at and I've been kind of familiar enough with boxing over the years, and kind of some involvement that I've had in boxing over the years. When we look at it, we can see that some of the good work that's being done up and down the island at times can be compromised or undermined by poor governance, or the perception of poor governance at regional and national level. And that kind of erodes the kind of faith and trust that key stakeholders have in the ability to be able to support boxing as a sport, funding partners, the general public, the kind of the politicians, Sport Ireland, sponsors, etc., don't support boxing in the way that they could and should, because of some of those underlying issues that they have and the perceptions that they have around the governance of the sport. And so, getting the governance model right will, and it probably is, the kind of last step in making sure that boxing kind of takes its rightful place as the most influential and kind of easily invested in sport in the country. So that's what's kind of at stake here, and that's kind of some of the stuff that we're talking about. In terms of the actual kind of origin of the review itself, so the review was commissioned, if you like, by the board, by the IABA board. It wasn't commissioned by Sport Ireland, and it was commissioned by the board in kind of recognition that carrying out an independent review of the governance model, whilst acknowledging a lot of the great work that was going on, and in particular some of the kind of steps that have been taken to professionalize the sport, there was a recognition that there was more work needed to be done, and in particular around the governance structures and the processes and some of the underlying behaviours and culture within sport. And so the IABA board asked for kind of an independent review, and I was asked to carry out that review. In terms of the process itself, I kind of consulted fairly widely. So I consulted with people at all different levels within the sport and outside of the sport as well. We opened it up to kind of the IABA board, obviously, the Central Council, to provincial boards, to staff, and then the outside of that, the kind of Sport Ireland and kind of other kind of key potential funding partners. So I got as many kind of diverse views and opinions, and kind of consulted widely to try and get people's perspectives on what was working, what wasn't working, what needed to be improved, and kind of where things were at. Coming out of the analysis of all of that and all the discussions that I had, there were probably kind of 4 key areas of findings, if you like. One was around culture and behaviours, and a sense that at times some of the great work that's been done up and down the island is being undermined by examples of poor behaviour within the governance model at kind of various different levels of the governance model. The second was that the actual structures themselves weren't kind of fit for purpose relative to kind of modern standards of governance in sport. There's been a lot of work being done in the modernization of governance in sport, and that things needed to change to reflect that. And a lot of other sports have already gone down the route of significant changes in their governance model, and boxing needed to do the same. The third area was the kind of link and relationship between the board, the organization, the IABA, and members, clubs. And kind of, there's almost like kind of a feeling that things are a little bit kind of too remote and disconnected, and the communication channels flowing down from the IABA and the board to the members wasn't as efficient as it could and should be. And so that needed to be looked at. And then the kind of fourth area was around tighter oversight and control around some of the activities within the organization, and making sure that they were tightened up. So they were the kind of main kind of key areas that people honed in on when we kind of were consulting with them, and in our own analysis and comparison with others. Out of that, we then kind of developed a whole suite of recommendations, and there's a lot of recommendations I appreciate in the report itself, but they're split into 7 main categories. The first of those categories is around what I would call governance principles, and these are kind of fairly straightforward principles around kind of the underpinning of the governance structure for any NGB. And a lot of them are kind of very common sense and motherhood and apple pie stuff about having kind of clear statements of purpose for the different areas of the governance model and clarity of roles and responsibilities, but nonetheless, very important to have so that they're kind of, we're set up for success from the outset. The second area of recommendations was around culture and behaviors, and addressing some of the issues that had kind of cropped up in recent times in relation to behaviors in and around the governance models and how to deal with that. There was plenty of anecdotal evidence and examples that people alluded to. But what we tried to do within the recommendations is to identify practical steps that could be taken to try and ensure that the underlying culture and behaviors were right. The third area, and probably the area of most focus for many people, was around the governance structures themselves. So what was and should be the setup of the governance model for the board, for central council, for kind of making sure that we kind of meet gender balance targets that are set by the government and Sport Ireland, and other kind of fundamental structures within the governance model. So we've set out a series of recommendations around the makeup of the board, the makeup of central council, how people are nominated and elected onto the kind of various different bodies, and how those bodies should operate and run. And again, they're kind of fairly important, and I know there's a lot of questions that people have in relation to those, and I'm happy to kind of come back and kind of deal with some of those questions in a moment. The fourth area of recommendations was around grassroots focus. So, we started out the report in highlighting some of the examples of the great work that's being done. And it's very easy when you're in the middle of any of this stuff to lose sight of the fundamental reason why everybody is involved in the sport, and that is to kind of serve the members, the kind of the grassroots of the sport. Without the grassroots, without the clubs, without the individuals who make up the clubs, we don't have a sport. And so there were a couple of recommendations, or a number of recommendations associated with making sure that the governance model is set up to service the members and to be listening to the concerns of the members and to be communicating better with the core membership. The fifth area of focus was around high performance, and a couple of recommendations around the link between high performance and the pathways leading into high performance, and making sure that that alignment is better. There was then a section around oversight and control, and then some kind of general recommendations at the end of the report that addressed kind of some other kind of areas, if you like, that needed to be tidied up, and that were also supportive of all of the other recommendations associated with the review. So, and in total, there's kind of 60 plus recommendations. So there's a lot of stuff in there. I guess there are one or two really fundamental recommendations that are the most important ones. And when it comes to the EGM on the 10th of July, essentially there's one key decision that the members of the IABA need to make, and that is in relation to the constitution and makeup of the board. And that's what you're being asked to vote on in the EGM. That's what Sport Ireland and the Minister are very focused on. And that, for me, is the critical decision that needs to be made at this juncture. All of the other recommendations that flow after that can be dealt with by whatever kind of board is put in place, is agreed in whatever structure is in place, and can be delivered over time. But the really critical component is to make sure that we set the constitution and makeup of the board and the overall governance model, set that up in the right way in the first instance. And that's essentially the kind of issue at point, and that you're being asked to vote on at the AGM. And I guess there's a number of questions and concerns that I'm aware of, and I'm happy to kind of address some of those, and then see if there's any additional questions that people might have that aren't addressed by that. I suppose one of the big ones was the change that's proposed in relation to the role of the president. So in the recommendations, it is recommended that the president continues to attend board meetings, but doesn't have a voting presence on the board. And I suppose there's some people asking questions as to why that is. Is that something that is done elsewhere? And what's the rationale for that? And I guess there's a number of points to make in relation to that. The first is that essentially the role of the president should be an ambassadorial role, and should be a role that represents all of the kind of the members, and to some extent should be above the politics of the board and the kind of voting decisions that get made within the board. Because if you have that, it then provides an arm's length relationship to the board for the president, and it keeps the president out of some of the controversial matters associated with kind of the business of the board, and able in a better position to be able to represent everybody across the sport. And how it would work in practical terms is that the president, whoever that the president is, he or she would continue to have a presence in the board, continue to participate fully in the discussions at the board, to continue to provide input and perspectives and viewpoints of the membership in those board discussions, but not be saddled with the kind of obligations of voting at the board, and also the collective responsibility of decision making at the board. Because once you're a voting member of a board, you're duty bound to stand over all of the decisions of the board, and kind of outside of the confines of the board. And so at times it can put somebody who is in an ambassadorial role like the president in an invidious position, and it kind of limits their ability to be able to represent everybody across the sport. It's not unlike Michael D. Higgins is not a sitting member of the Dáil, for example, or the cabinet. Again, it's a kind of slightly different role that the president has in terms of that ambassadorial role. In terms of sport and sporting bodies, there are many sports that have adopted this model. So if you look at the Irish sporting landscape, Sport Ireland categorise all its different sports, the NGBs, into Type A, Type B, and Type C organisations. Type C organisation is an organisation that has professional staff employed, has a CEO, has a board, is a limited liability company, and employs professional staff. So boxing would be regarded as a Type C organisation. And the other Type C organisations in Irish sport include athletics, swimming, golf, tennis, hockey, cricket, sailing, basketball, badminton, gymnastics, rugby, soccer. I'm probably leaving out one or two, but when you look across them, there are, in the case of swimming, hockey, cricket, basketball, badminton, and gymnastics, they've all reformed their governance model, and they have exactly the same structure that's been recommended here in terms of involvement of the president as a non-voting member of the board. So it's very typical in Type C organizations. It's not universal, so there are other organizations that haven't moved to that yet, but certainly the trend is that is the way that a lot of organizations are going when they reform their governance model. And so the recommendation in relation to the president is consistent with that. So the president would still have a very active voice at the board, but not be saddled with responsibility around kind of voting, and therefore leaving he or she to be able to perform the ambassadorial role. In terms of a couple of other questions in relation to that, one was, is it possible to have why have an independent chair of the board? And again, the organizations that are moving to reformed governance models, and a lot of the ones that I've just called out, are doing so with independent chairpersons in place. The FAI is a really good example of that. That's kind of recently gone through a fairly significant governance reform, and have put in place kind of an independent chair into the role. And again, in that regard, that's a model that Sport Ireland endorse, and as a key funding partner, that's an important influential voice. And they do so because they believe that it provides additional objectivity and perspective. It enables a wider range of skill sets to be catered for, and provides a kind of greater degree of confidence in the governance structures of a sport. So for that reason, they're very keen to have independent chair persons put in place in boards. And there's a suggestion that possibly you could rotate it between a kind of, the president and an independent chair, and on a kind of year on, year off, or 2 year on, 2 year off basis. My experience is kind of rotation models like that don't work, and they don't provide the continuity that's required, and it causes confusion in terms of the kind of clarity of roles, and tends to lead to more kind of inefficiencies in the governance model, rather than solving kind of some of the underlying issues and problems that can be present in governance models. So for that reason, that's not something that we would recommend, and hence the kind of recommendation for kind of the continuation of an independent chairperson. And we're also recommending an expansion of the independent directors. And again, there's 2 primary reasons for that. One is, first of all, to provide that kind of diversity of skill set, and bring that kind of independent perspective and professional expertise and objectivity to the organization, and balance that with people from involved within the sport. So for me, the best model is where you have a balance of people from within the sport itself, and then independent directors, some of whom can come from within the sport. There's nothing to stop people from within the sport being nominated as independent directors if they have the right skill sets. But it leads, in my experience, to better decision making and better outcomes and better results when you've got that adequate balance. So what's being proposed in the recommendations here is a balance of 6 independent directors, 6 nominees from within the sport and different parts of the sport. So that's the kind of the model, if you like, that's being recommended in that sense. And again, that's something that would be strongly endorsed by Sport Ireland in terms of kind of best practice that they're kind of aspiring to. I suppose that then raises the question, that, and a very valid question that people have. The sport has been around for well over 100 years, and it has delivered very successfully over that period of time. So why can't we just continue to run the sport with just boxing people running the sport? And I suppose the answer there is that for me it's better with a balance of both. That it's not exclusively run by independent people outside of the sport. Equally, it's not exclusively run by people who are deep in the sport. That if you can get that balance, then you've got an appropriate balance of boxing people with a deep knowledge of the sport and independent people who bring different ranges of expertise from professional backgrounds that can add to the decision making and to the kind of perspectives around the sport itself. And we are in a world where all the sports are kind of chasing the same funding pots, the same kind of group of sponsors, the same making the same cases for investment in their sports. So whether we like it or not, it is something of a competitive world to attract some of those external stakeholders. The ones that are being more successful are the ones that have that better balanced kind of governance model, and where those people who are investing in those sports have greater level of confidence because of that balance, and some of the kind of independent thinking that's brought by the presence of some level of independent directors. So that's some of the rationale in relation to that. That then begs the question, who decides who is selected as independent board members? And what we've recommended is that an independent body is put in place to provide the confidence that the overall process is set up in the right way, and that kind of strategic decisions are made about the composition of the skill sets required, and to avoid any potential conflicts of interest, etc. But ultimately, the members will decide who is on the board. So that independent kind of body will make recommendations. Ultimately, the decisions will be made by the members. And in terms of kind of what types of skill sets are required, you know, all the skill sets that are required to run any sport and to run any business essentially need to be covered off. Another critical point in relation to all of this is the need for gender balance. So in the action plan for sport, Sport Ireland has made it mandatory that all NGBs have a 40% gender representation on their boards by 2023. We currently stand at 0%. So we've got a bit of a way to go. And there's also not just the Sport Ireland pressure that's been applied in relation to that, but also that's what any other funding partners will be looking for. Sponsors, local councils, kind of anybody who's putting money into various different organizations, not just sporting organizations, will not continue to do that if they don't see that kind of diversity and gender balance is not addressed. So it's really important that that happens. Now, the expansion of the number of independent directors provides us with an opportunity to get more female representation on the board through that channel, but equally, the representatives from within the sport also need to reflect a better gender balance. And so it's a combination of both that will ultimately, hopefully, address that and decide that and get the balance right. And we've got a short time frame to get that right. In terms of the kind of nomination process, therefore, from the kind of provincial bodies, what we've recommended is that provincial bodies nominate 2 people, a male and a female, and then depending on the balance of the makeup of the board, that will determine which of those nominees ultimately is put forward for nomination. But the final decision is a member's decision. So the independent body will have a look at the makeup of the various different nominees, both from independent and from the kind of provincial representatives. And then they'll make a proposal around the kind of final makeup of the board, and that'll be put to members, and members will have the final say on that. And of course, another question that I've been asked is, can boxing people with expertise in the relevant areas put themselves forward as independent directors or as the kind of coach representative or the athlete representative? And the answer, of course, is yes. There's nothing to stop anybody from within the sport. And there's plenty of people with lots of expertise right across the sport putting themselves forward for nomination and being considered and kind of going through the process in the same way that kind of everybody else does or can. There's also obviously kind of recommendations in relation to Central Council and the kind of current makeup of Central Council. And the universal feedback that I got in the consultations was that Central Council has too many people potentially on it, and that it needs to be kind of refined a little bit. And so there's recommendations associated with that. And again, as I said, that was pretty universal in all the conversations that I had with various people. A couple of other questions that people have is, will this have any impact on the clubs? You know, does this really matter as far as the clubs is concerned? The answer is emphatically yes, it will. The reality is that there is a lot of funding that ultimately finds its way into the clubs. For example, at the moment, there's a capital funding program that Sport Ireland run. Boxing has benefited to the tune of €259,000 to that fund. funds like that are threatened if the kind of the fundamental kind of governance reform isn't done. So that will have a very significant impact, and you know, the impact will be kind of far-reaching across all the kind of funding within the sport. Well over 90% of the funding source for boxing comes through Sport Ireland and other government-sponsored stakeholders. So that funding, unfortunately, is a threat if the governance model isn't reformed. Will there be a benefit to clubs? So one thing is kind of securing the existing funding. Will there be more funding made available? Again, I think the answer to that is yes. One of the recommendations that we've made is the establishment of a fund to directly support clubs in terms of equipment grants and other kind of expenditure in relation to the kind of how the clubs are run, and that is controlled through the board, made available by Sport Ireland and controlled through the board. So that's an immediate benefit if that does eventuate. And equally, if there's increased confidence in the governance model, then you can see the impact. For example, in the FAI, you can see sponsors like Sky have now got on board subsequent to the governance changes that they've had. The Olympic Federation went through a very significant change post-Rio, and they're now attracting quite a significant amount of commercial revenue through sponsors, because they've much greater confidence in how the organization is run. So those things are important benefits. And then the minister has been pretty unequivocal in some of his public statements about what will happen if the kind of fundamental change in relation to the constitution of the board doesn't pass at the AGM, and so, you know, kind of you know, there's a real threat from government circles that will have a kind of fairly significant impact. So for all those reasons, I think existing funding will be threatened, and the opportunity for attracting additional investment into the sport, which, as I said at the outset, the sport deserves and is ripe for, will be threatened if we don't go down this route. So there are some of the issues that I think are at stake here in relation to some of the decisions that are being kind of made at the AGM. At this point, I'm happy to kind of throw it open to questions, and I know there's already been a couple of questions that have come into the chat function, so I'll just have a quick look at those and answer those. So the first is from Neil Goff: would the president of the IABA be the chair of the new board? The answer is no. There would be an independent chairperson, and the president would be an attendee at board meetings and a participant at board meetings, but not a voting member, for the reasons that I outlined at the outset. And then the follow-up question to that was, how can he or she represent the clubs if they can't influence any decisions on behalf of the clubs? So the president absolutely can and should be bringing those perspectives to the board and to the board discussions. The difference is we're proposing that the president isn't saddled with the kind of voting responsibility that goes with that. So it actually makes it easier for the president to provide that ambassadorial role and to provide that kind of voice of the clubs, because they're not being seen to have any skin in the game in the actual decision that gets made. So it allows the president to be able to bring that voice in a way that kind of is better and absent of any of the voting kind of obligations that go with being a full voting member of the board. And as I said, that's consistent with the model that's in place in swimming, in hockey, in cricket, in basketball, in badminton, and in gymnastics, and is working very effectively for them. In fact, in the case of two of them, basketball and gymnastics, the president doesn't sit on the board at all. I think that's not what we've recommended here. The president would sit on the board, just not be a voting member of the board. and therefore, to Neil's point, is capable then of being able to fully represent the viewpoints of clubs and members in those board discussions. I'm quite happy if there are, I'll just check to see if there's any other questions that might have come up. Fran Long, I don't know if there is a question that you have. If you can kind of type the question into the into that facility, that Q&A facility, I can deal with the question, or into the chat function. I'm not sure if you're able to do that, but if you are, then I can deal with the question. So there's one just in from Linda Morgan there. So Sport Ireland runs a governance course. Can we get this for IABA council members and provincial, etc.? Yeah, really good question, Linda. In fact, one of the recommendations that I've tabled is that there is a governance and leadership program that's put in place and run annually, and that we have up to 16 places on that, and it's dedicated for boxing, and that we have an emphasis on younger people and females to participate in that, but that it's made kind of generally available to anybody who's involved in the governance model, and that if we run that over the next couple of years, so the idea would be it would be kind of something that would run over, say, a 12-month period, and we run it over kind of 2 or 3 years. Very, very quickly, you have a whole kind of generation of administrators who would have been through a really good, comprehensive governance program and course, and it provides us with a lot more people who have the kind of fundamental skill sets and the understandings of what's needed from a governance perspective. So yeah, that's a very specific recommendation that we've included in the review, and that I think would get very strong support from Sport Ireland to make sure that it happened. So hopefully, Linda, that addresses that question that you've asked. I'm just checking to see if there's any other questions. I don't see any other questions that are in there at the moment. Okay, yeah, this was one there from Fran. So the president's background would be from a coaching or an official's background. It's important that the members don't lose their voice in decision making. Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. So what's proposed is a balanced board of people from a strong background in boxing, and independent directors, some of whom could have a background in boxing as well. So you've got the kind of provincial nominees that come through the kind of 4 provincial regions. You've got somebody from a coaching background that's nominated from a coaching background, and you would also have somebody from a former athlete background as well. And in that way, what we're looking to do is to try and make sure that you've got an adequate balance of perspectives from the regions, from coaching, from athletes, and with the broader kind of skill sets that are required to support running a business, all represented in the new structure. So the idea is that it's a more balanced, broader, bigger, slightly bigger structure in terms of the board that provides the basis to enable kind of everybody to be represented, and to have all the skill sets covered. So that's the kind of the rationale, if you like, behind the recommendations that have been made as they are. I'm not sure, Fran, if that answers your question. I hope it does, but if there's any follow-ups, please do just kind of type in any follow-up, and anybody else who has any other questions that they might want to ask, happy to take them as well. I don't see any new questions coming in just yet. But again, I'm happy to give it another minute or two in case there are. Kira, I know you're there as well. I don't know if there's any others. Yeah,
I can't see any more questions coming in, but I have invited everybody to submit another question if they would like to do so. And if you wish to submit a question, now is the time to do it.
Yeah. So again, happy to hang on for another minute or two, just in case there are any additional questions that any people might have. And it might be useful as well if people don't have any more questions, you might type that into the chat box as well, so that we know that there's nobody that kind of is trying to get a question in that for whatever reason can't. So if you equally, so if you don't have a question, just say in the chat box that you're happy and you don't have any additional questions. So I'm not seeing anything coming into the chat box at all. So I'm going to assume that people don't have any additional questions. Oh yeah, okay. Thanks, Linda. So in regards to examples of reform, I choose England boxing when we're aware of a split. Yeah, so one of the things that we wanted to do was we weren't looking at England boxing as an example of necessarily a governance model to follow, but we did want to understand the structure that they had in place, particularly around high performance, because in the English model, high performance was separated from the core of the sport, and there were some people who were asking the question: is that something that we should consider and look at? So we had a look at that as a model, and we concluded that we didn't think that was the right model. Certainly in the case of Irish boxing, we think it's really, really important that there is a pathway right throughout the sport, from the grassroots all the way through into kind of high performance, and all of our athletes that we celebrate when they win medals and thankfully copious medals in boxing's case, come from the grassroots of the sport, and to separate the two would be a mistake. And so the reason that we looked at the structures in English boxing was just so that we could kind of, do our due diligence on that and make sure that that we had looked at that, but we were very clear that that's not the model that we wanted to go down. So again, I'm not sure, Linda, if that answers that question, but hopefully it does. Yeah, okay, thanks, Linda.
Fran has another question in the Q&A section.
Oh,
Brian.
sorry. I'll switch into that. So as far as I'm aware, from an IABA point of view, the only person that is recognized by the world body is the president. Yeah, so again, from an ambassadorial point of view, there's an important role that the president plays, and kind of the president, again, this would be typical of other sports as well. When it comes to representing Irish boxing on the world stage, there is a role for the president, and that's part of the ambassadorial role. But there is a difference between that and the kind of running of the business of a board, and in fact, separating the role of the chairman and the role of the president, and being clear about the kind of delineation of responsibilities in that regard, makes it easier for both roles to be effective. Sometimes that confusion can cause kind of issues and problems. I suppose it's one thing that I didn't reference, but maybe I should, is obviously IABA has its own issues from a governance perspective, and there's a lot of pressure obviously coming from from the kind of the Olympic kind of movement and others in relation to IABA and its governance structures and models and reform of those. So the president would still have a role in representing Irish boxing on the international stage, and that is not in any way limited by the recommendation for the president not to be a voting member of the board. So again, Fran, I'm not sure if that answers that question for you adequately, but that's feel free to add another question if you need to. Again, I'll give it another minute or two just in case there's any people typing away or kind of any final questions that need to be addressed. Not seeing anything coming in just yet.
Nor am I. So if there are any final questions, I think for the final time, this is the moment at which to submit them.
Okay. Doesn't look as if there's any final questions. So look, thank you to everybody for taking the time. I appreciate it's an evening and you're giving up your own free time to do this. So I really appreciate it. I hope I've given you some level of clarity around some of the information that I provided and the kind of questions. If there are any additional questions that you might have, there's another session like this in a week's time. And obviously you're all free to join that again if you wish, and to add any additional questions that you might have in the meantime. And reach out at any stage through the guys in the IABA if you do have any additional questions, and I'll try and address them offline.